This time, most of our things come from outside. It is the business community which has to rethink over these things, how we can actually encourage and take newer adventures in actually nativizing economy. And in this sense, Mir Said Ali Hamadani is very relevant today, who, when he saw the poverty of the people here, brought skilled persons who taught skills to the people here that actually gave a boost to our economy. This time I'm just, as a lay person, I'm saying these things because you'll have expert comments by the expert, but what I'm trying to say, this lecture is very important because the speaker will actually talk about how we have to create a parallel government of the people. In a way, it will be a kind of radical democracy through which we can go for lots of things where we will not have to depend on the government. Because we have seen last time, youth have shown us the way, we have the potential, we have the capacities, only thing is that we have to tap this potential. And that is why, again, I will say nativizing the economy. We have to turn the consumer economy into growth economy. And that is possible only when we will not misuse agricultural land, when we will not misuse horticultural land, when we will actually boost our own productions in all, in the various sectors. That's very important. That is something which gives us durable strength in our day-to-day lives. That's why we have invited Majid Mattu Saab, who is a prominent British banker and economist of Kashmiri origin. He is the founder of Commonwealth Capital and the former global head of investments at Commerce Bank AG. Born in Kashmir, Dr. Mattu was educated at Britain's Imperial College, where he earned MSc and PhD, awarded the prestigious National Westminster Bank Research Fellowship in Financial Economics at London University. And Dr. Mattu is the author of Structured Derivatives, published by the Financial Times in 1997. May I have lecture?
It's a great pleasure for me to be standing here talking to the future. An outside view matters more than the inside view. You see, I left this place in 1984, and it is 30 years to the month that I've not really lived in Kashmir. So I carry with me the images, including the beautiful images of this beautiful garden campus, the University of Kashmir, and the ethos and the culture of Kashmir as it existed then. All of those images, all of those impressions, all of those emotions are imprinted on my mind as if it is only yesterday I have left this place. Obviously, we learn. I have lived amongst the Europeans. I have lived amongst the Americans. I have lived, very importantly, amongst the Asians of Chinese origin. The reason I say that is because that's relevant to what I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to educate you on the history of our beloved homeland, or indeed the political developments that have enveloped this state for decades. I'm a lifelong student of economics. I left this place to learn, not to earn, to learn. I remain a humble student of economics. It's very interesting. Obviously, coming from the West, one of the first things that comes to mind is, can I trust these numbers? And that's very important. even if I do, the very first thing you learn about the state's economy is that it's a very small economy. It's a $12 billion economy. Now, $12 billion is the revenue of an average Western company, big company. So let's put things into perspective. But then, Jammu and Kashmir economy is part of the Indian economy, which itself is not a very big economy. The gross domestic product of India is roughly $1.8 trillion. And according to the figures in this survey, Jammu and Kashmir, on nominal basis, accounts for 0.8% of the Indian economy. That's less than 1%. Now that has many implications because Jammu and Kashmir, and when I say Jammu and Kashmir, I'm primarily referring to the Kashmir province, but not to get into political controversies, I'm going to refer to the state as it is. The state of Jammu and Kashmir is not an average state of the Union of India. Even Indian government recognizes this state as one of the 11 states which enjoy a special position within the economy of India in terms of economic dispensation. So this has nothing to do with politics. Now, having enjoyed all of that privilege since 1947, it's disconcerting that this economy remains so small. Because the average Kashmiri is intelligent, is entrepreneurial, is well-fed, which fulfills all of the basic conditions necessary for sustained economic growth. And that does not seem to have happened. The other dimension really is when we study this economy, you can't ignore the political dimension as it affects the economy. So conventional tools that economics provides us are not going to be sufficient to analyze this economy for two reasons. One is this is not an economy as we speak of an economy in the conventional sense of the term. You see, this state does not have any fiscal levers, doesn't raise its own revenue. This state does not control money supply, doesn't control interest rates, doesn't control external trade. So it's not an economy. So all of the macroeconomic framework that we have developed over the last 100 years is not really applicable. So when I was thinking about this the other day, what came to mind is the tools we need to apply to this economy are truly the tools of political economy. Now, those of you who study economics would know political economy is the root of the discipline of economics. And political economy itself is rooted, for those of you who are interested in the history of this discipline, is rooted in moral philosophy. So when Adam Smith wrote The Causes and the Nature of the Wealth of Nations, popularly known as The Wealth of Nations, in 1776, which is considered to be the first proper academic treatment of economics, he was a professor of moral philosophy at Glasgow University. The second reason why political economy is important for us in this situation is Kashmir is part of a federal economic structure in which, particularly in the case of this state, and again, you can get the numbers from this, much of the revenue base for the state comes by way of grants from the union. So what that means is the state is dependent on a significant proportion of its revenue base from New Delhi. Now, the relationship between Srinagar and New Delhi in economic terms is obviously not purely economic. It has a very significant political dimension. So all of the revenue base that comes from New Delhi is negotiated in the context of the overall political relationship between the state and the center. Again, pointing to the need to use the tools that are provided to us by political economy. The political economy, as I said, it's one of the oldest fields of intellectual inquiry by humans within the realms of moral philosophy, but it's coming back into the academic fashion. In fact, many of the Western schools, economic schools, provide streams on political economy because politics has entered economics in such a way that it is difficult to separate the two. So I'm going to talk about the Kashmir economy in terms of this politico-economic framework that we must understand to begin to address the issues that this state faces. I will come to the topic of this lecture, reconstruction post-floods, in the context of my overall views. One of the things at the very outset, obviously, which should be obvious to all of us in the context of floods, is when floods came, you notice two things. Whether you were actually living in Srinagar or watching it elsewhere in the world, the government was missing. Now, the government was missing, to me, does not mean the chief minister of the state was missing. The government was missing, to me, means that state apparatus collapsed. So what that means is, if you were to ask a political scientist, what that means is we don't have a state. We have a political state, we have the boundaries, we have the political framework, but we don't have the political infrastructure. We don't have the infrastructure that makes a state a state. The reason people come together in a state is precisely for this reason, that collectively we enjoy the security and safety of the state. Now, obviously, when a state fails in that basic function, you have to question the very existence of the state. Secondly, we also noticed, even before the waters of the flood started to recede, the emperor had no clothes. But whether it was Emperor Srinagar or Emperor New Delhi, it was very clear they had no clothes. The mighty nation of India could not manage even 1,000 inflatable boats to be sent to this place. Now you see, when you claim to be a future superpower, it is a terrible indictment. So, given this situation, where do we begin? And that's a big challenge. When you start with the premise that there is no state, There is no state apparatus. There are bureaucrats everywhere. There are bureaucrats everywhere. Every bureaucrat has tens of people around them as security people, as cooks and this and that. But that together does not constitute the state apparatus. So the question is, where does one begin to fix the economics of this state? The best way, I guess, to start really is to maybe highlight the problems that you, as the state subjects of this state, can identify. To me, one of the biggest problems this state faces relates to you, the students of this university. When you leave this university with your well-earned degrees, how many of you expect to land a decent and rewarding job in this state? You haven't probably even started the process. Imagine the army of young, unemployed that roam the streets of Srinagar, Islamabad, Baramulla, Sopore. It's not difficult to miss. You don't have to rely on government statistics. Youth unemployment is a huge problem. The second thing that you will immediately relate to is rampant inflation. Now, the state, which according to the government statistics constitutes about 40% of the economy, their earnings are obviously usually inflation linked, which in itself creates a wage inflation spiral, but that's a different matter. I'm not going to get into that. But for common people whose earnings are not linked to the general rise in prices, life becomes difficult year in, year out. Now, does the state apparatus have any tools to address this? The simple answer is no. A problem that some of you in the front row, the business people, will identify with is lack of investment, lack of credit. Now, this is something I'm going to devote some time to, because this is very important and is the only solution to all of the other ailments of this economy. Unless we have investment, which cannot happen without the availability of cheap, very important, cheap, affordable, and abundant credit, we're not going to be able to revive this economy. We also have a problem that you will all identify with, which is rampant corruption. Now, you see, we usually talk about corruption in social terms. We say it's a social evil, or it's a moral evil, or it's this evil and that evil. Now, let me make a very categorical statement. As an economist, I reckon corruption is the worst economic evil that a human can ever know. Nothing corrodes an economy more than corruption. For all of the obvious reasons, plus the technical reason, because it leads to misallocation of resources. And once misallocation begins, it is difficult to arrest it, it is difficult to correct it. Which is why every country that has sincerely tried to eradicate corruption has found it very difficult. It is very easy to let it take hold, very difficult to get rid of it. And it's a problem. It's a problem and it's linked to the economic situation of this state. Now, I know it's a bigger problem in the region, but we're concerned with the state. We also have issues with very strong economic implications that some of you may relate to, but some of you may oppose. But I think it's very important to highlight. You see, when a budgetary process takes place, when ministers sit across the table to discuss who gets what for what part of the state, you will never hear that the district of Baramulla had a fight with the representative of district of Islamabad. You don't hear that. Or Srinagar. But you will always hear there are problems in allocation of the state budget among the provinces. So you have Jammu fighting rest of the state, Ladakh complaining against the Kashmir province, and vice versa. Now, this is a relevant issue for economic development because economic development must take place within a cohesive society. You see, if France and Britain were to become one economy, it will not succeed because it won't be a cohesive society. French are very French, British are very British. And European Union is a very good example. The reason we have a very pressing economic crisis in Europe is because none of the 27 members of the Eurozone is willing to cede fiscal sovereignty to a central authority. They are willing to suffer, and they've been suffering for the last 5 years. They're willing to suffer, but they are not going to cede the fiscal autonomy to the European Union, to the center. We don't have that. This state does not have that. It used to, but it doesn't have it anymore. So when you are bidding for a chunk of the budget, this tussle between the regions is damaging. Because for the same, obviously it's unfair, it's not equitable, but for the simple technical reason of misallocation. So if one region of the state is 10% of the population and gets 40% of the budget allocation, that's unfair to a layman. But to an economist, this is a very large misallocation of resources. Because we have to understand the way economies grow is not very complex. But the way we organize that process can be made complex quite deliberately, which then makes it very difficult to analyze for corrective measures. And usually, the best fix really is to fix the problem in its bud. Now, I know this has political dimensions, but there has to be a way of being transparent and open about this issue, i.e., this rather damaging process of budgetary allocation across various provinces of the state. Then there are issues which all of you know. There is no industry here. There's no power here. Roads are in terrible state. Hospitals are in dire straits. But those problems are known to everyone. Then we come to the parts of the economy that have the potential to deliver economic dividend, and those are in bad state as well. Our horticulture, our tourism, our handicrafts. None of these sectors is growing in a way that can generate jobs and that can lead to sustainable development, sustainable growth. And I come back, and I will keep coming back to this issue of creating jobs, because that is the primary reason for economic growth. You see, without economic growth, you can't have jobs. And for the simple reason, if you are a household and your income does not increase, you are not going to think of getting an employee in your household. You will only get an employee into your household if your income is rising. If your income is not rising in real terms, then you are not going to do that. Similarly, if the economy is not growing, new jobs cannot be created. And unless an economy creates new jobs, it is not possible to sustain the society. A poet, I don't recall the name, writing about the Industrial Revolution in England in the 18th century, warned people about the Satanic dark mills that were coming up everywhere. These were sweatshops, factories were being built for the first time in the world in England, around Manchester and Sheffield. And this was dislocating for intellectuals. So this poet warned that in order to counter these satanic dark mills, we must develop chariots of fire. And I remember a very sage former president of World Bank once said, if cities don't deal with poverty in a constructive way, poverty will deal with cities in a destructive way. And unemployment has exactly the same potential. If we don't tackle the problem of unemployment in cities, and usually the unemployment problem is an urban problem, if we don't deal with urban unemployment in a constructive way, urban unemployment will deal with cities in a very, very destructive way. So in order to tackle the problem of unemployment, let's take just one aspect. What do we need? We need businesses that are growing, but above all, we need new businesses. I'll give you an example of Germany. German economy is the only, Germany, by the way, is the biggest economy in Europe. It's the biggest, it's bigger than Britain, it's bigger than France. It's the biggest economy in Europe. Much of the German economy consists of what they call SMEs, small and medium enterprises. Much of it. And the entire financial architecture, entire financial system, banks, development banks, and other financial institutions are geared towards promoting SMEs. Now suppose you are a budding entrepreneur. You want to create your own company, you want to create your own business. What do you do? Where do you go? You can go to the bank. Highly unlikely you're going to get anything. You can go to the government. I saw their allocation for that kind of activity. I think it's risible. That's the only word that comes to mind. It's something like £1 million, $1.5 million. So what do you do? Now you see, when this state was in relatively good shape, you could actually go to your bank, which was Jammu and Kashmir Bank, and they would help. But not anymore. Because Jammu and Kashmir Bank, which was created for this state, has now become the bank of the rest of India. It certainly mops much of the deposit base in the state, but I understand only 18%, I stand to be corrected on this, only 18% of the lending takes place in the state. Now that, to me, is a huge bottleneck. Because while the problem is creating employment and the solution is creating new businesses and growing existing businesses, keeping government outside of it now, because the government of this state is already very bloated. It's a very big government for a very small state. Then we have a problem. So one of the first things that this state needs to do, and you must fight for it, is to bring your bank, Jammu and Kashmir Bank, back to the state. Jammu and Kashmir Bank must begin to be the banker of the people of this state. Not lend money to businesses outside the state who have access to a large number of financial institutions out there. In my opinion, one of the biggest blunders the government of Jammu and Kashmir made was when they privatized Jammu and Kashmir. You see, if you go to the Jammu and Kashmir website, I urge you, all of you, go to the Jammu and Kashmir Bank website and see what do they sell. They'll tell you we have won this award, this award, this award, this award. Who cares? Why should you care? Why should the state care what award they win? As an economist and as a practicing banker, Jammu and Kashmir Bank, I do not care whether Jammu and Kashmir Bank pays a dime in dividends, makes $1 in profit. Jammu and Kashmir Bank's function is to develop this economy. And unless this is the single most important thing that we, the people of the state, can do, and the government of the state must do, is to bring Jammu and Kashmir back into the state. And if that doesn't happen, if that's not possible, then Jammu and Kashmir state must create another bank, which must replace Jammu and Kashmir Bank to be the state bank. And that bank must behave like every other major bank in every other developing country. You see, I spent many years advising Asian governments. I have spent a lot of time with China's biggest bank, Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, ICBC, the biggest bank. There are 4 banks in China that are commercial banks. They almost form the monopoly. They're all state-owned. See, the most important thing is they're state-owned. And you see, China is an economy which is 4 times bigger than India, more than 4 times bigger than India. In international dollars, meaning on purchasing power parity basis, China is now the 2nd biggest economy after the United States. If mighty China doesn't feel the need to privatize its commercial banks, who is the state of Jammu and Kashmir? I mean, do these guys understand anything about economics, about business, about finance? And that is an act of plunder. It's an act, nothing less than an act of plunder. The 4 banks of China, their non-performing loans today in 2014, when China ranks right next to the mighty United States of America, officially, which again, we don't trust these numbers and we don't trust Chinese numbers either. Officially, they say non-performing loans of the 4 biggest Chinese banks is 10%. In 1998, the non-performing loans of the biggest Chinese banks amounted to almost 40%. You see, when you are building something to loss, you don't care about the cost. A very simple analogy is, when you are building a house, do you see your mothers and your sisters carrying buckets on their shoulders? Why? Because they're building something to last. They don't mind the price. And that price has to be paid by every developing economy. West has paid it. You know, this idea of leapfrogging, we must get there in 10 years where it took the West 200 years. This is hubris. And the important thing is, we don't have to reinvent anything. I'll give you another example. Singapore is a tiny state. It's a city-state. Singapore was part of the Federation of Malaya. When the Brits left Malacca, it became the Federation of Malaya. In 1963, government of the Federation of Malaya, and this is unprecedented, asked Singapore to leave the Union. This has not happened anywhere. So Singapore is a city. It became a state. And this state did not have any resources at all. Now, our state is full of resources. From water, to horticulture, to tourism, to handicrafts, to minerals, a lot of resources. Singapore, the state of Singapore, does not even have drinking water. Singapore actually imports water from Malaysia to drink. There's a big pipeline that comes across the Johor, which brings water from the Malaysian peninsula into the Singapore state. And they started in 1963, and the per capita GDP of Singapore at that time, in that year, was around $470. Now, 63 is not, that long ago. Today, Singapore's GDP is $53,000 per capita. So how did Singapore do it? What do they have? They have no resources, not even water. No water. It was a disease-infested, absolutely disease-infested backwaters in the 60s. So if Singaporeans can do it, why can't this state do it? We have everything. What's the difference? I spent a number of years amongst the Singaporeans. Obviously, the very first thing you notice is probity, financial probity. Secondly, and as an economist, most importantly, when Lee Kuan Yew, the senior statesman, the founder of Singapore, when he sat across the table with his colleagues, he actually, when Malaysia asked Singapore to leave the Union, Lee Kuan Yew went on television to announce it to his people. He cried. He actually physically cried. He did not want to leave the Union. But he was handed this and he had to take it. There was no choice. They sat across the table and they decided, what do we do? How do we survive? We don't even have drinking water. So again, instead of starting to reinvent the wheel, they said we can learn from others. Others have done it. And this is true not just for Singapore, it's true for Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, Taiwan, Hong Kong, South Korea. They all learn from Japan. Now, Japan obviously had developed earlier, but had taken the same route that England took in the 18th century. And we have a term for it in economics, mercantilism. Mercantilism, obviously, in the 18th century was used to justify colonialism. Mercantilism, in layman's terms means beggar thy neighbor. Let my neighbor be poor, I don't care. I want to be rich. That's what it means. Obviously, the difference between England doing it, England and France were the key players who practiced mercantilism in the 18th century. In fact, Jean-Baptiste was a French economist who operationalized it. He gave the framework why it is necessary. Japan, by the time Japan started to implement it, they had modified it, world had moved on, And all of these countries said, we are not going to follow United States of America. Because I learned from some of the distinguished people here that people are plotting the ideas of the West in this state. These people don't know what West is. They don't know how West got where it is today. This place, no place, does not require a textbook solution. When England developed, they had no textbooks to read from. The good fortune of England was they invented the steam engine, which led to their economic development, of course, which led to the economic growth around the world. So despite their colonial past and the terrible things they have done, they have given us a lot. Imperial College, where I spent 8 years, gave us penicillin. Penicillin, humble penicillin. And our medical experts will understand the importance of that. Millions, billions of lives have been saved by that simple invention, penicillin. Alexander Fleming found it accidentally in a lab at Imperial College. So their development story was driven by this invention of steam engine. Now, America did not invent steam engine. So you see, they can't say, well, okay, let's develop another steam engine and that will kick. No. There is no textbook solution. When it came to Japan's turn, they internalized what others had practiced, but they developed their own unique model of mercantilism, which is, in practical terms, we don't have the steam engine, so we have to do something. They turned almost all of their educated people into experts of something, which is where electronics took roots in Japan. But who did it? See, it wasn't the professors in the universities. It wasn't Tokyo University who decided, okay, let's start, this thing called electronics. Nobody heard of it. And this is where the difference between the British and the Japanese come. Japanese learned from the Chinese because Chinese had practiced this concept of Mandarin for centuries. Mandarin. I met some of our Mandarins 10 years ago in the Department of Finance, the Ministry of Finance here. I was very sorry. Now, Mandarins are technically bureaucrats. Secretary of the department is a Mandarin. But in the Chinese world, the Mandarin meant he represents the sovereign. He embodies the sovereign, the monarch. So he is not working for a salary, doing a 9-to-5 job. He is working for his country. He has devoted his life to his country. That's why he's the Mandarin. That's why the word Mandarin comes, which is why British picked it up from the Chinese, which is why, people who work in the Whitehall, which is the equivalent of the North and South Bloc in Britain, the bureaucrats there are called Mandarins because they work, they promote the interests of Her Majesty's government. And who does Her Majesty embody? Her Majesty embodies the popular will. She represents people. And I want to come to this. And I'm very sorry if I digress here. It's very important. It's very important. You are all intellectuals. So I'm not going to make it. I'm not going to give you something that you just chew easily. No. Make what you make of it, but it is very important to hear these things. So the Japanese use the Chinese concept of Mandarin and British concept of mercantilism, and they created a new thing. Today, one of the most feared government departments in financial markets today is not Federal Reserve of America. It is the Mandarins who sit in the Ministry of Finance in Tokyo. They're the ones we watch. Of course, to the world we say, Federal Reserve is God, Nauzubillah. But it's the Mandarins sitting in the Ministry of Finance. Now, how many of you know the Mandarins of our place? Do they ever visit here? Do they ever talk to anybody? Do they show any inclination to learn anything? I asked the chief Mandarin 10 years ago, can I see the map? Which is when they actually started this process, the surveys. Can I see the map of the state, the economy of the state? He said, sir, what's that? I packed my bags and left it was in Jammu, I left the state. When it came to Singapore, you see, they already had this Japanese model. Now, they said we're a very small country, very small, not even 1 million people at that time. What do we do? So they picked bits of mercantilism. I want to come to the thing that is common among us, because that's what I want to apply here. Not what is, we're not going to invent steam engine. That's already been invented. It would be great if we can invent something, that the world hasn't seen before. So we want to dissect these and pick the common factor. What is the common thing that has made these countries grow and become big that we can apply here? Because this is across time and space. England in the 18th century, we're in the 21st century now. It was 300 years ago. And Singapore in 1963. So there must be something common that they're doing which is helping them grow. So they did all of that, and they added their own bits. Ditto, Malaysia, because Malaysia then started to follow Singapore. That's how they grew. And they regret to this day. Publicly they don't say it, but I know I've had conversations with very important people. They regret letting Malaysia and Singapore go, because they wonder, economic history, if you go back to the year in which Jesus Christ was born, China was next, 25%. So between the two of these, everyone except the ruling classes, the feudal lords. Even they were, an ordinary person living today would put numbers, so it's not something we can test in a lab. But almost zero. Excluding the last 200, 0.5%, something like that, 0.5% growth. As to what we need for economic growth is activity. Keeping in mind they were a very big economy long time ago, long before Europeans came out of dark ages. They obviously started with their own original concept. So when they created their mandarins, I mean, this is mother of all mandarins. And that was obviously, effectively, the political denunciation of 79. India was in dark ages. It took China a while to get things right, because China was a very large country, it was a communist country. India came close to defaulting on a sovereign bond, which is what led to IMF intervening, which is what then led to India opening up. Was the year Chinese economy and the Indian economy became exactly the same size. Because the populations of the two countries are similar, so per capita income became very similar. So what is it that China did during these intervening years that India, then India? Mandarin. Mandarin became very... So when you think about the common strand, I use the word Mandarin, economic model. That's the important thing. Now that model, the poorly known as the Washington Consensus. The Washington Consensus, in very simple words, means governments have to be small. Every country must open its markets to everyone else, which obviously means to them. Collectively, at different points in time, decided they're not going to play by their game. Rather, they will learn from British mercantilism, Japanese model. In fact, Japan is what they followed. Japan is what everyone in Asia followed and achieved tremendous economic development. Now, you would all say that's exactly what India does. India controls a lot of things. The Ministry of Finance, and obviously the situation when it comes to states becomes even worse. The havoc. They embody the economic will of people. If the political will of the people, the exercise of finance embodies economic development of their place. So the first thing we have to do to reconnect across ministries, I don't think we should care if somebody is Secretary of the Home Department today and the same guy becomes Secretary of, I don't think. We need to, before we can restructure the economy of this state, we need to restructure the Ministry of Finance. Secondly, and I in the business interest of its shareholders, irrespective of who its shareholders are. If we do just these two things, and these mandarins bank, that will solve half the problem. Then there is the question of the policy framework. What do we do? There, the problem is also a normal state. People of different political persuasions, people will differ, and that's normal. That's how it should be. The representative nature of parliamentarians, who represents how much popular vote, the problem is legitimacy. When you send your representatives to the assembly, they lack legitimacy. Now, that in itself would not be important. The trouble is, when it comes to the economics of the state, unless you represent the popular will, you are not going to be able to make the hard economic choices. You are not going to be able to represent the case of the state, the people of the state.
Lecture, and I would request the audience if they have questions, and he will be ready to answer any question. We don't have much time for interventions, speeches, but he can take the questions and answer them in as brief a manner as possible. Thank you.